I was 6 years old when Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link came out. But like a lot of kids back then, I didn't get around to playing it until a few years later. Still, I remember the buzz, the energy, the feeling of knowing that The Legend of Zelda, the game that completely blew my young mind, was getting a sequel. And not just any sequel, a real continuation. The same Link, the same Hyrule, the same magical sense of adventure, or so I thought. When I finally got my hands on it, something felt different. Gone was the top-down view that had become iconic. Gone were the screen-filling dungeons and cryptic item placements. Instead, I found side-scrolling combat, towns full of NPCs, a level-up system, and a difficulty spike that didn't just punish you, it dared you to keep going. For years, Zelda 2 lived in the shadow of its legendary predecessor. Critics praised it, but players were divided. Some called it bold, others called it broken. And over time, it became the black sheep of the franchise, the game people like to forget. But today, we're going back to an era when sequels weren't safe, when developers took risks because there was no blueprint for success. This is the story of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, a game that dared to be different, a game that challenged everything we thought a Zelda title could be, and maybe, just maybe, a game that deserves more credit than it's ever gotten. Chapter 1. The Pressure of a Sequel. The Legend of Zelda wasn't just a game, it was a phenomenon. When it launched in 1986, it gave players something they'd never experienced before. A sprawling open world filled with secrets, dungeons, puzzles, and that unforgettable feeling of freedom. You weren't being funneled through levels or guided by arrows. You were just dropped into Hyrule with a wooden sword and a mysterious cave. And from there, it was up to you to figure it out. I was a kid when I first played it, and honestly, it was magic. I'd never seen a game like it. The gold cartridge, the save files, even that booming title screen music felt like the start of something epic. I didn't know it at the time, but Nintendo had just rewritten the rules of what video games could be. And so, of course, the expectations for a sequel were sky high. But here's the thing. Nintendo doesn't usually follow trends. They create them. And when it came time to make a second Zelda game, they didn't want to repeat themselves. In fact, they actively avoided it. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creative force behind both Mario and Zelda, was never one to rest on success. In interviews, he's talked about how he viewed sequels as opportunities, not to retread old ground, but to try something entirely new. And with Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, that's exactly what he did. Released in Japan in January of 1987 on the Famicom Disk System, Zelda 2 was developed under intense time pressure. Nintendo had just launched the Disk System the year before, a peripheral that used floppy-like disks instead of cartridges. These disks were cheaper to produce and allowed players to save their game progress more easily. But they came with trade-offs, limited memory, slower loading times, and a need to rethink how games were structured. That pressure was felt by the development team. While Miyamoto and Tezuka returned as producers, directing duties were passed to a rising designer named Tadashi Sugiyama. It was his first major directing role, and under him, Zelda 2 began to morph into something bold and experimental. The decision was made early on. The sequel would not look or play like the original. Instead of a purely top-down adventure, Zelda 2 would split its gameplay between a bird's-eye overworld and side-scrolling action segments. The combat would be faster, more physical. The enemies would block, jump, and strike with precision. Link himself would now jump, cast spells, and gain experience points like a character in a role-playing game. It was a massive departure from what players were expecting, and that was the point. Nintendo didn't just want to make another Zelda. They wanted to push the boundaries of the hardware, to explore new mechanics, to see what this fledgling franchise was capable of. From a development standpoint, Zelda 2 was ahead of its time. It introduced elements that wouldn't become common in action RPGs until years later. A leveling system that influenced stats like attack, magic, and health. A rudimentary magic meter. Towns filled with NPCs that gave quests, offered hints, or healed Link's wounds. These may seem like standard RPG tropes today, but on the NES they were almost unheard of. Zelda 2 was experimenting with mechanics that hadn't yet been fully defined, and it was doing so within the strict limitations of 8-bit hardware and a single year of development. The stakes were high, not just creatively, but financially. Zelda 2 followed hot on the heels of Super Mario Bros., Metroid, and Kid Icarus, all of which helped cement Nintendo's reputation as a creative powerhouse. But the NES was still in its early days in North America. The console war was heating up, and each new release carried the weight of proving that Nintendo wasn't a one-hit wonder. So when Zelda 2 finally made its way to the West in late 1988, it arrived with an unusual mix of fanfare and confusion. It was a Zelda game, sure. The gold cartridge even looked the same. But it didn't feel like the game players had fallen in love with just 2 years earlier. For kids like me who were used to wandering open fields and bombing random walls, the shift was dramatic. Suddenly, I had to learn sword techniques, time my jumps, conserve my magic, and grind for experience. It felt more like Castlevania than Zelda. And yet, despite the learning curve, there was something compelling about it. Something different, something dangerous. Looking back now, it's easy to see Zelda 2 as a risky move. But at the time, it wasn't just a sequel. It was Nintendo asking a question that would define the series for decades to come. What else can Zelda be? Chapter 1.5, Building a Sequel, The Making of Zelda 2. Every great game has a story behind it, not just the one you play, but the one that happens before the game even begins. And with Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, that behind-the-scenes story is just as fascinating and just as risky as the game itself. By the time The Legend of Zelda had become a cultural phenomenon in 1986, Nintendo was firing on all cylinders. Super Mario Bros. Had made the NES a household name, and Zelda proved that gamers wanted more than just side-scrolling platformers. They wanted worlds to explore, stories to get lost in, challenges that didn't just test reflexes, but curiosity. But while the first Zelda was a smash hit, Nintendo didn't yet see the series as a long-term franchise. At the time, sequels weren't about building sagas. They were opportunities to iterate, experiment, and surprise. Enter Zelda 2. It wasn't developed by the exact same team as the first game. In fact, it was one of the earliest examples of Nintendo handing a successful IP to a new creative lead. While Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka remained on board as producers, directing duties were handed off to Tadashi Sugiyama. Masayoshi Orima, a rising talent inside Nintendo's R&D4 division. It was his first directorial project. Sugiyama had previously worked as a graphic designer and character artist on earlier games, including Ice Climber and Balloon Fight. Taking the reins on a Zelda sequel meant not just continuing a legacy, but challenging it. And that's exactly what he did. From the beginning, the team knew they wanted Zelda 2 to feel distinct. The original had nailed exploration. This time, they wanted to focus on action, specifically swordplay and player growth. Around this same time, Super Mario Bros. Had exploded in popularity, and Nintendo was beginning to refine its approach to 2D side-scrolling. It made sense to carry that momentum forward, but in a very different genre. The result? A blend of action platforming and RPG mechanics unlike anything else on the console. But this wasn't just a design decision. It was a necessity, too. The original Zelda was built for the Famicom Disk System, a Japanese add-on for the Famicom that used rewritable discs instead of cartridges. These discs had more storage than typical NES carts and allowed for saving progress. Crucial for games like Zelda, Metroid, and Kid Icarus. And so, when Zelda 2 entered development, it was also built for the disk system, and with that came limitations. The game's structure, overworld for travel, side-scrolling for action, was partially inspired by the need to load smaller segments of the game into memory. The experience and level-up systems helped keep the game engaging even when backtracking or grinding. And the live system? That was a holdover from arcade game design, where challenge and punishment were standard. Internally, the team was stretched thin. Nintendo was developing Super Mario Bros. 2, the Japanese version, later released in the West as The Lost Levels, Metroid, and Kid Icarus, all within a tight window. Incredibly, Zelda 2 was developed in under a year, a staggeringly short timeline for such a bold reinvention. And with Sugiyama still early in his leadership role, much of the game's identity was shaped by fast iteration, trial and error, and team-wide collaboration. There are hints that the original vision for Zelda 2 may have been even more ambitious. Unused content found in the game's code, hidden rooms, enemy placements, and even spell behavior suggests that parts of the game were cut late in development. In some versions, unused dialogue suggests more character interaction was planned. There was even discussion at one point about using the Famicom Disk System's built-in microphone feature, something explored in other games like Zelda, No Densetsu, and Kid Icarus. And then there's the music. Composer Akito Nakatsuka, who hadn't worked on the first game, brought a new musical flavor to Zelda 2, more energetic, more driving, with a sense of movement that matched the faster-paced gameplay. The Palace theme in particular is one of the most memorable tracks in the NES library, later remixed in titles like Super Smash Bros. And Hyrule Warriors. Despite the rushed timeline and hardware limitations, the team delivered something truly daring. When the game finally released in Japan in January 1987, it pushed the disk system to its limits. But when it made its way to the West, Nintendo had to convert it to a traditional NES cartridge, and that came with compromises. The Western release featured downgraded sound and some graphical simplifications, but it also added battery-backed saving instead of disk rewriting, which made it one of the few NES games at the time that didn't rely on passwords. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was fearless. And in hindsight, it's a miracle it even exists. In less than 12 months, a brand new director led a small team to build a genre-blending sequel that challenged conventions, bent hardware limits, and reshaped one of Nintendo's most important franchises. Before that franchise even knew it was going to be legendary. This wasn't just a game about Link leveling up, it was Nintendo leveling up too. Chapter 2. A brave new direction. From the moment you press start, it's clear that Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, is playing by a different set of rules. There's no title crawl, no epic overture, just a quiet, pixelated palace and a sleeping Princess Zelda. Not the one we rescued in the original game, but a different Zelda altogether. A deeper legend, a more ancient curse. Already the tone has shifted. The stakes feel larger, and the world more mysterious. But it's not until you step outside and see that new overworld that the transformation truly begins. Gone is the familiar top-down, tile-based Hyrule from the original game. In its place is a stylized, zoomed-out map with miniature versions of Link, towns, forests, deserts, and roads. It almost feels like a strategy game at first, like you're moving pieces on a board. But as soon as you bump into an enemy, everything changes. The screen fades. The music shifts, and now you're in a side-scrolling action sequence. This is where Zelda 2 plants its flag. Combat isn't just directional sword swiping anymore. It's tactical. Enemies block high and low. You have to crouch, jump, time your strikes. You learn techniques like the down thrust and up thrust, which add depth and verticality to the sword play. Link, for the first time, feels like a true warrior. There's a rhythm to the battles, almost like fencing. You jab, you block, you back away, then leap forward again. And when you win, you earn experience points, not rupees, not items. XP. This was one of the most shocking additions for longtime fans. Zelda had always been about exploration and items, but now you were leveling up. You had stats, attack, magic, life, and you could choose how to upgrade them. You could grind weaker enemies to boost your power, or risk pushing forward to get to the next palace before spending your XP. In other words, Zelda was flirting with the RPG genre. And it wasn't just the XP system. The world itself had evolved. For the first time, towns were added to the Zelda universe. Places like Rauru, Saria, Naburu, names that would echo through the series in future installments, were filled with villagers, wise men, healers, and the occasional old woman offering you a spell to help you. Some were helpful, some cryptic, some flat-out misleading, but each town was unique, with its own layout, its own mini-quests, and sometimes its own secrets. And it made Hyrule feel alive in a way the first game never quite did. You weren't just wandering through fields and forests, you were visiting real places, talking to people, helping them, learning about the world. It gave Link a deeper purpose, a stronger connection to the people he was saving. Then there was the magic system, another first for the franchise. Rather than collecting items to solve puzzles, you now learned spells, and you needed them to survive. Shield to cut down damage, jump to reach high platforms, life to restore health, thunder to decimate enemies. Magic points became another precious resource to manage, especially in the later palaces, where every spell cast had to be carefully weighed. And that's what defined Zelda 2. Resource management, challenge, and choice. In the original Zelda, you could brute force your way through most problems if you had enough bombs or knew where to look. In Zelda 2, you couldn't just explore, you had to survive. Death came quickly. And with only 3 lives, no continues, and a harsh checkpoint system that sent you all the way back to the North Palace when you died, every decision mattered. And yet, despite the difficulty, there was something addictive about it. Every enemy you defeated, every level you gained, every new spell you learned, it felt earned. Like you were growing stronger with Link, not just controlling him. And while many fans rejected the change, others embraced it. Because at its core, Zelda 2 wasn't about abandoning the Zelda formula. It was about evolving it, taking the DNA of the original and experimenting with something new, something more action-heavy, more demanding, more personal. Zelda 2 didn't just challenge players to explore Hyrule, it challenged them to master it. Chapter 3, a game of brutal challenge. If there's one thing players remember most about Zelda 2, the adventure of Link, it's the difficulty. This wasn't just a hard game, it was punishing, relentless, the kind of difficulty that left a mark, not just on your thumbs, but on your memory. Back then, we didn't have save states or rewind features. No YouTube walkthroughs, no game facts. You either figured it out or you didn't. In Zelda 2, it made you earn every inch of progress. The enemies were smart and aggressive. Iron Knuckles, with their twitchy shield movements and sword strikes, could block most of your attacks unless you timed your hits perfectly. Lizalfos leapt and lunged with brutal precision. And the flying Moas? They drifted across the screen unpredictably, often knocking you into lava pits or right into other enemies. And that was just the overworld encounters. The palaces, this game's version of dungeons, were mazes filled with death traps, elevator shafts, looping corridors, and enemies that could two-shot you if you weren't careful. Some even had fake walls you could walk through with no visual indication. Others required specific spells to even enter. You had to be prepared, you had to grind, you had to learn. And then there were the lives. 3 of them. That's all you got. Die 3 times, and no matter how far you traveled, no matter how close you were to the next boss, the next town, the next palace, the game threw you all the way back to the North Palace at the very start of the game. No mercy, no mid-game checkpoints, just the slow, painful march back across the entire map. I remember how defeating a palace boss didn't just feel like a victory, it felt like survival. Like you'd climbed a mountain with no ropes and barely made it to the top. And even then, you weren't safe. The further you got into the game, the more ruthless it became. New enemies were faster, more erratic. Magical attacks drained your life. And the Great Palace, the game's final dungeon, was a test of endurance unlike anything else on the NES. Even getting to the Great Palace was a nightmare. You had to cross a bridge guarded by fire-spitting enemies, navigate invisible maze paths in a lava field, survive waves of attackers in a harsh desert, and once you made it inside, forget everything you thought you knew. This was the final exam. The enemies were stronger, the layout was massive, and worst of all, if you lost all your lives here, you didn't start back at the entrance. You started outside. That's right. Even at the final stretch of the game, it still sent you all the way back to the entrance of the Great Palace if you failed. Hours of progress. Gone. And yet, somehow, that didn't stop us. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe deep down, we just liked the punishment. Because every time we pushed through a tough room, figured out a boss pattern, or clutched our way to another level up, we felt invincible. Zelda 2 didn't hand you victories. It made you bleed for them. I remember being a kid, staring down an iron knuckle with barely a sliver of health left, palms sweaty, Knowing one wrong move meant starting everything over. And when I won, I jumped out of my seat like I just won the Super Bowl. That's what this game gave you: intensity, consequences, and the sweet, sweet rush of overcoming something that genuinely felt impossible. Today, we throw around the term Souls-like to describe tough but fair games. But Zelda 2? It was doing that decades earlier. It was an 8-bit precursor to modern trial-by-fire design, teaching patience, pattern recognition, and perseverance long before we had names for those things. Of course, not everyone loved it. Some players bounced off the difficulty entirely. Others found the mechanics clunky, the live system unfair, or the XP loss too punishing. But for those who stuck with it, Zelda 2 became a badge of honor, a personal legend, a story to tell. Not everyone beat this game, but everyone who did remembers. Chapter 4. A world richer than you'd think. On the surface, Zelda 2. The adventure of Link is remembered for its combat, its difficulty, its departure from the Zelda formula. But underneath all of that, beneath the side-scrolling action and the RPG systems, was a world that was quietly richer and more alive than anything Nintendo had done before. This was the first Zelda game to introduce towns, and not just as decorative hubs or places to rest, but as fully explorable, interactable spaces filled with people, dialogue, secrets, and story. You could walk into someone's home, talk to an old man who might teach you a new spell, or maybe just tell you something cryptic like, "Only the hammer can break roadblocks." You'd meet women in red dresses who'd restore your health, others in blue who'd refill your magic, something we now jokingly call getting healed, but back then felt like a necessary pit stop on a brutal journey. But there were deeper interactions too. A child kidnapped by monsters, a woman who wouldn't speak to you until you proved yourself, a town completely overrun by enemies pretending to be villagers. For a game released in 1987, this kind of dynamic world building was wildly ahead of its time. The towns had names: Rauru, Saria, Naburu, Darunia, names that would later show up in Ocarina of Time as sages. At the time, we didn't realize it, but Zelda 2 was quietly building a foundation for the series' larger mythos. Even the geography was ambitious. This wasn't the same Hyrule we knew from the first game. The overworld map was massive, filled with hidden paths, secret caves, invisible zones that only appeared with the right spells or exploration. There was a whole second continent, entire stretches of the game that you might not even realize were accessible unless you talked to the right person in the right town. And that's something players often overlook. Zelda 2 rewarded curiosity. Yes, it was brutal. Yes, it punished failure. But it also encouraged you to talk to NPCs, to revisit towns, to pay attention to clues. In many ways, this was Nintendo's first real attempt at narrative layering in the Zelda universe. The original game had lore, Ganon, the Triforce, the 8 pieces you had to collect, but it was minimalist. Zelda 2 introduced something deeper. A sleeping princess, not the one you rescued before, but an ancient royal placed under a magical slumber long ago. A legend that would shape the royal bloodline for generations. Link's quest in this game wasn't to defeat Ganon, at least not directly. It was to recover the Triforce of Courage and awaken the original Zelda. That piece, the final third of the Triforce, is what completes the balance of power, wisdom, and courage. Without it, the kingdom can't be whole. And it's only in Zelda 2 that we see Link as a true successor to that legacy. He's not just saving the day, he's earning his place in history. The lore runs deeper still. Ganon is dead at the start of the game, defeated in the first adventure, but his followers remain. And they're trying to resurrect him using Link's blood. It's dark, almost mythological. Every time you get a game over, the screen flashes red with the silhouette of Ganon and that chilling line, "Return of Ganon." That screen haunted a generation of kids. It made failure feel like more than just losing a life. It was a narrative consequence. And that's what made Zelda 2's world feel so real. For the first time, Hyrule wasn't just a place you explored. It was a place you lived in. The people had problems. The land had history. The legend had layers. And while future games like A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time would expand on that mythology in even greater detail, The seeds were planted right here, in this strange, side-scrolling, often overlooked sequel. Zelda 2 didn't need to go that deep. It could have just been an action game with dungeons and bosses. But it did. And in doing so, it quietly changed the way the Zelda series approached storytelling, character, and lore. Not just for that generation, but for all the ones that followed. Chapter 5. The Final Trial. The Shadow Within. By the time you reach the final stretch of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, something changes. You're not just playing the game anymore. You're fighting it. Every step feels earned. Every enemy is a reminder of how far you've come. And every death, a gut punch that dares you to give up. But if you've made it this far, if you've collected all 6 crystals, conquered every palace, learned every spell, and fought your way across both continents, then you know what's waiting for you. The Great Palace. It's not just the game's final dungeon, it's a rite of passage. Getting there is a brutal gauntlet. You cross a narrow bridge surrounded by lava, dodge relentless flying enemies, and navigate an invisible maze through a scorched desert. There's no hand-holding, no compass, just your instincts, your magic meter, and a handful of lives. And once you arrive, the game does something unexpected. It gives you a checkpoint. For the first and only time, if you die in the Great Palace, you don't return to the North Palace. You respawn at its entrance, a small gesture of mercy in a game that has offered none. But don't let that fool you. The Great Palace is the most demanding section of the entire game, a sprawling, multi-layered labyrinth filled with enemies you've never seen before. Winged beasts, fire-spewing dragons, bird knights who block every attack and strike without warning. The music here is different, urgent, driving, almost sinister. It's telling you, this is it. This is the end. You'll burn through magic. You'll cling to every pixel of health. You'll second-guess every turn, wondering if you missed a hidden path or fell into a dead end. And then, after hours of grinding, fighting, surviving, you reach the final room. The guardian of the Triforce of Courage awaits. But it's not a monster. Not a returning villain. Not Ganon, who remains a looming shadow throughout the game. It's you. A shadow version of Link rises from the floor. Silent, formless, ready to fight. Dark Link. For many players, this was the moment everything clicked. The moment you realized the final test wasn't about your sword or your magic. It was about your ability to conquer yourself. The battle with Dark Link is deceptively simple. No flashy attacks, no changing phases, just a one-on-one duel against a mirror version of you. Same speed, same moves, same reach. But it's one of the most difficult, nerve-wracking fights in the game. You can't predict him. He mimics your every move. Attacking blindly gets you punished. Standing still invites disaster. It becomes a test of patience, of timing, of composure. There's a reason this boss fight has become legendary. It's not just because it's hard, it's because it means something. In a game all about growing stronger, mastering magic, and becoming the hero of Hyrule, your final obstacle is yourself. And when you finally land that last blow, when Dark Link fades into the void, it's not just a victory, it's a transformation. Link steps forward. The final room glows, the curtains part, and there, at long last, is the Triforce of Courage. With all 3 pieces reunited, Link returns to the North Palace, where Princess Zelda lies in her enchanted slumber. As the screen fades, he lifts the Triforce, and she awakens. No fanfare, no celebration, just a quiet moment of resolution, the end of a journey few players ever finished. And then, the credits roll. For those of us who made it, the feeling was unforgettable. Not just because we beat a brutally hard game, but because we conquered something deeper. Zelda 2 wasn't just about saving the kingdom. It was about proving we belonged in that world, that we were worthy of carrying the Triforce. And after all the trials, all the deaths, all the frustration, we were. Chapter 6. Legacy and Reevaluation. When Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, released in the West in late 1988, it arrived with the weight of expectation. It was the sequel to The Legend of Zelda, one of the most important video games of all time. It came in a shiny gold cartridge just like its predecessor. It had Link, Zelda, Ganon, and the Triforce. But the moment players booted it up, they knew something was different. And for many, that difference was hard to accept. The reviews at the time were solid. Zelda 2 scored well in gaming magazines and sold millions of copies. But among fans, it quickly became divisive. Some embraced the challenge. They loved the action, the RPG mechanics, the complexity. Others bounced off it entirely, confused by the side-scrolling, frustrated by the live system, turned off by how little it resembled the original game. And over time, as the franchise grew, with A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and so on, Zelda 2 became the odd one out, the black sheep, the forgotten experiment. Nintendo never made another Zelda quite like it, and in interviews over the years, even Miyamoto admitted that the game's approach wasn't what fans were expecting. And yet, its influence never really went away. The RPG elements? They came back in subtler forms. Magic bars, experience systems, skill upgrades. All concepts that quietly made their way into later entries. The towns, the NPCs with side quests, hints, and personality. That became a cornerstone of the series going forward. The lore introduced in Zelda 2, like the concept of multiple Princess Zeldas, the lineage of heroes, the Triforce of Courage, laid the foundation for the complex timeline Nintendo would eventually build. Even the names of towns in Ocarina of Time were direct callbacks to Zelda 2 Rauru, Saria, Naburu, Darunia. All were named after towns from this very game. And that final boss fight, Dark Link, it's become iconic, referenced and revisited across multiple Zelda titles, from Ocarina to Twilight Princess to Tears of the Kingdom. Over the years, something interesting started to happen. As players revisited the NES library, as video essays and retrospectives took over YouTube, Zelda 2 began to be re-examined. People started to appreciate what it was trying to do, not just how it failed to meet expectations. It wasn't a broken sequel. It was a bold one, a creative risk. And in a time when sequels often play it safe, that risk stands out more than ever. Was it perfect? Not by a long shot. The difficulty curve is brutal. The design can be unforgiving. And the RPG mechanics, while innovative, were clunky by today's standards. But it was also fearless, experimental, visionary in its own strange way. And if nothing else, Zelda 2 proved that the Zelda franchise wasn't afraid to evolve, to take chances, to stumble, to grow. And honestly, that might be the most Zelda thing of all. Today, when I look back on Zelda 2, the frustrations, the late-night retries, the moments of victory, I don't see a failure. I see a game that dared to ask a question. What else can Zelda be? And that question is still shaping the series today. In the grand tapestry of the Zelda series, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link remains the outlier, the strange middle child that rarely gets invited to the reunion. But maybe it's time that changed, because behind its rough edges, its punishing design, and its unconventional gameplay lies something rare. A game that took risks when it didn't have to. A game that tried to evolve a formula that wasn't even fully formed yet. A game that gave us the first taste of what Zelda could really become. And for those of us who played it, really played it, the memories have stuck with us. Not just because of the challenge, but because of what it meant to overcome it. Looking back, I don't just see frustration. I see heart. I see ambition. I see a game that swung for the fences. And even if it didn't stick the landing for everyone, it made history. If you've never played Zelda 2, maybe now's the time to give it a shot. Or maybe give it a second chance. It's not easy. It's not always fair. But it is unforgettable. And if nothing else, it reminds us that legends aren't always born perfect. Sometimes they have to fight their way into legend. Thanks for watching.